Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for another episode of Keeping It Behavioral, where we're empowering parents one episode at a time and breaking down behavior analytic topics to what they look like in the real world. My name is Ray Trank, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Adrienne Baggs. This episode, we're going to be exploring essential inquiries for individuals and families seeking ABA services or applied behavioral analysis services, specifically in the clinical setting. So selecting the right ABA provider is really important for you just because not all ABA providers have the same level of expertise and align with your needs and values as a family. Not saying that, and I mean with everything, right? There are good providers, better providers, all that.
That's such a nice way of saying that. Yeah.
But, you know, an amazing, fantastic provider still may not be the right fit for your family.
Well, 100%.
And that's 100% okay.
Well, I feel like it's just like finding good doctors and finding good, like you're going to seek out people that have personalities that maybe fit better for your family.
Yes.
And every clinician, their experiences really shape their approach as well, you know?
Absolutely.
And so it's going to shift what types of things that they might prioritize when they're, you know, providing and guiding your family through the care of your child. So a big focus of this podcast, it's going to be one of our shorter ones, but we really just wanted to give you guys a list of just some questions and things that can help guide finding your you know, good
Absolutely.
fit for your child, and things that we
the best fit.
Yeah, the best fit, and things that we as providers you know, would definitely ask if we had kids going into ABA therapy and looking for what our fit would be if we had kids that were looking for those services.
Yeah, and so we broke it down kind of in two different areas. So the first is just the way that the clinic is set up and specific questions pertaining to that. And then the second portion is related more to the quality of care.
Right.
And really both of those married together is, you know, what you end up getting out of the services. So, you know, and again, for all of these, there's not really a right or wrong answer.
100%.
It's what's going to meet the needs that you have as a family, and really weighing it, because every clinic has different hours. Like some may have shorter hours, where some may have more like evening hours. And so those are all, please excuse my husband if you can hear that.
Adds a little spice to the episode. I like it.
But you know, those are things that you'll have to weigh too, is like, will it fit my schedule? And really prioritizing, you know, maybe a different provider answered one of the other questions a little bit better, had like a better methodology to something. But I mean, just like with everything that you have to make choices with in life, right? It's that response cost of what is going to work to meet our needs.
Well, and I feel like finding a provider is almost like how you would handle like a job interview in a way, where it's like
100%. That's
just,
a good comparison.
Yeah, just like when you're interviewing for jobs, like of course they're trying to learn about you, but at the end of the day, you're also trying to figure out, do I want to work for this company? Do they have values that I agree with? And I feel like it's the exact same thing with the clinic, right? Figuring out if that's going to align with you. So I guess we can just kind of dive into, at first, talking about some of our general clinic setup type questions. One of the first ones that I know I would definitely ask a provider would be, what is your caseload size? And so this might not seem like it's that big of a deal, but
because caseload is essentially how many clients are under one BCBA.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes. And so the reason why we felt this was a pretty important question is burnout is very high in our field. And just like, you know, navigating your own emotions and your own needs, it can be really challenging when you are working with an analyst who maybe has 14 plus.
Well, and I think another consideration too is you need to because there'll be a number, right? But it can be weighted differently depending, because some clinics only have like full-time clients and some have part-time clients. So someone may have a caseload of 7 full-time clients and someone else may have 12 clients, but those are all part-time clients. So essentially it breaks down into night.
That's a important distinction.
Yeah.
I think. But if let's say in a world it's all full-time.
Yes.
If you're working with someone and then you say, hey, how many kiddos are on your caseload? And they're like, oh yeah, I have 12 to 15 full-timers on my caseload. Okay. Maybe they're an analyst that is like super amazing at time management and making sure that they're providing all of those quality care aspects to your kiddo still. But if I were to hear that, I'd say, okay, so maybe we don't have a ton of time with our analysts. Maybe they're not going to be able to be as present for my child as I would maybe like them to be.
Yeah.
So I feel like looking for a clinic that does have some of those smaller caseload sizes can result in maybe better quality care.
Yeah. Which I think goes into the next question, which is how much supervision do your BCBAs provide their technicians?
So how much oversight are they giving to their technicians to ensure that the plans that they're taking the time to create and individualize for your child, making sure that they're being run with fidelity and they're being run correctly to ensure the best outcomes.
And that will tie directly into the caseload size. Because 100%. If your caseload is too big, you're not going to be able to provide
quality care. Right. Because you don't want to be working with an analyst who sees your kiddo once a month. I mean, things change day to day. Yeah. So making sure that...
And I think that's another good question you can add too, is how much supervision do you provide and how frequently?
Are you going to see my child?
Yeah. Is it, twice a week?
Because that drastically impacts outcomes and human beings, like we all make mistakes, right?
Yes.
So the more that you're able to be with your team as an analyst, the more you're able to make sure that those small little things are done correctly because they end up being the big things.
Yes.
And then I guess that kind of goes into our next question, which is how often is the family expected to engage with the BCBA in those one-to-one meetings, which, like we said, there's many names for them: family engagement, parent training, whatever you want to call it. Essentially, how often is that time where you're going to have one-on-one attention from your BCBA to ask specific questions about your child, their progress, how things are going, as well as your BCBA being able to set some goals for you at home. Yeah,
and provide you support for how to implement and, generalize our favorite word.
Yeah, we threw that out there.
Skills, in the home setting. And I think it's okay too, right? If they say a number like an hour a month or something that maybe you're like, okay, but I feel like I need more support and I'm not going to be satisfied with that, asking if it's flexible, because they may have a company standard, but if you have more individual needs, they're more than happy to do it more frequently to meet your needs. And just kind of making sure, and in the same sense, right, if they have an expectation of meeting once a week and you're like, my family can't commit to that because of, XYZ.
2 working parents or whatever.
Or not having flexible jobs, whatever it is, just having a conversation and be like, okay, we can't commit to that, but we can commit to once a month or whatever it is. Are y'all able to accommodate that? And kind of starting that off right off the bat, because you don't want it to impact the care that you're receiving down the line if they're saying that you're not, meeting their expectations as well of, doing it, just being upfront and being like, hey, this is what we can commit to, and kind of going from there of whether or not it's going to be a fit.
Well, and I do think, too, most BCBAs I know would be really excited if a family was like, oh my gosh, I'd love to meet once a week.
For sure.
Just because you have that buy-in, that the family is,
Well, things change so frequently.
Yeah. So it's nice to have that constant line of communication. And that's not to say that families that meet less than that don't have buy-in, but it's more to say that I always appreciate when I can give those frequent updates. And sometimes it does result in quicker meetings too, because you don't have quite as much to cover.
You don't have to kind of go over everything that's happened in the last month. It's just been the last week.
Right. And then I guess another question is just general clinic policies. And every clinic is very unique in how they handle this.
Yes. So, like, looking at their attendance policy, do they, have a really strict attendance policy to where you can be, considered for, discharge if you're not meeting it, which would be where they're saying, we can no longer be a provider for you. How often, or are there any limitations on the number of vacations we can make, the number, how soon do we need to call out if we're not able to provide, like bring our child in for that day's session. And again, there's no right or wrong answer, right? Some people have like flexibility with their jobs where they're traveling frequently, or they go stay with grandma for long weekends all the time, and that's fantastic.
Yeah.
But just making sure that you're letting them know, because ultimately you don't want it to cause a disruption to services down the line, because
or you
they
scrambling
had
last
different
minute
expectations than what your expectations were.
And I think too, this kind of ties into our family engagement question. Some companies will have a requirement where it's like, if you do not meet with the BCBA at least once a month, your child will be discharged.
Yeah.
So making sure that you're aware of all those things allows you to make the most informed decision, because there are some providers that are really flexible about those things, and maybe you need that. So it's just a good thing to keep in mind, because life happens and you want to plan for that.
Yeah.
So that you make sure you find a place that would allow you the flexibility if you need it. And then our next question, if you want to.
Yeah, so how much experience will my child's BCBA have? And I think an important distinction is like years, and then also experience with like specific behaviors. Like, let's say your child engages in, self-injurious behavior.
Headbanging,
or headbanging, nail picking, something like that. And, maybe you've been with other providers before and they weren't able to provide, enough support to it. So asking the specifics of this behavior, has had a lot of difficulty, getting support on. And so I want to make sure that their BCBA has experience with it, is doing professional training in it, all that. I do think, years of experience, it's all relative, right? People can
100%.
be their first year and they'll be the best one you've ever worked with in your life. And then there are others who have been a BCBA for like 10, 20 years. And you're like, why do you work here?
Because this is
awful.
not.
So, but I think too, like just experience in the field, because people just come from different backgrounds, right? That will impact their quality, too, and just
perspective on that care.
Absolutely. And I mean, it never hurts to know too,
Right.
and you can always kind of dive more too into it, especially if they're able to like tell you the specific BCBA would be the one working with your client, and if you're able to meet them on a tour, highly recommend doing that, just because, right, we all have personalities that we mesh really well with, and then we have ones that we don't mesh well with. And so being able to like off the bat be like, this person is not vibing with me, and is there flexibility to where I could, or if I started with this person and my instinct was right, can they change?
Well, and just ensuring and like you said too, so years of experience is not everything. But let's say you are with someone who is a little bit more green. Maybe you really like them, but they don't have the experience that you necessarily are looking for your child. I think they can still learn and still be a good fit down the road. So I think that could be a question too. Like, let's say that is who your child is going to be assigned to. Knowing that they're going to have supports in handling your child's case, I think will be important.
Yeah.
And so I think that's just something to keep in mind. Our next kind of general question is just, what is the policy for families coming in to observe? Obviously, during your meetings with, your BCBA, there's going to be a lot of information thrown at you. There's a big learning curve, I think. And so sometimes coming in there, seeing what it looks like when a technician is the one administering the treatment plan to the child can be really beneficial in helping you get a better picture of what it actually looks like. Because someone can explain something to you until they're blue in the face, but it might not click in that way. But some clinics do have strict policies about that, just because obviously you're providing care to a variety of different kiddos, and so there can be some HIPAA-based
Yes.
protections that make it more challenging for parents to do observations. So it just, I think, would be a good thing just to kind of get clarification on.
To set your own expectations for, because
Right.
if maybe you've had some like bad experiences in the past where it is more difficult to trust you, that may be like your hardest limit of like, I need to have transparency to where like
I can
walk in, and we have a meeting and like we'd be able to do that, or someone, maybe it's not your BCBA, but like the person who's doing operations be able to give me a tour, just for that peace of mind. Because again, if that is something, because I think anxiety around having someone who you trust watch your kid. Trust is 100%, but trust is built. And so especially in the beginning, you may just need more reassurance. And so just making sure your provider is going to meet your needs for the reinsurance that you need.
And I think with that too, like, let's say you are with a provider who's like, yeah, I'm sorry, like, observations are not something that we do here. There are ways too that you can still feel like there's transparency. So something too, like I know I've done this with families before, is I'll take a video during a session and then send them the video of like, oh, here's how we handle XYZ. That way they still have the transparency. They still have that visual of what something looks like.
Well, and I think that goes into like another piece, which is the communication piece. So what does daily communication look like, and how accessible are you to like spur of the moment, communication? Because if you're having a child who's getting services, right, they likely have a communication delay component as well, which makes it hard. So maybe it's just like, well, they woke up, they're not sick, but they're also not like 100%, and you may just want to be able to text someone there,
right.
Maybe not the BCBA. Every company has different policies of like
how to
who to check in with that. But just like, are you able to get that like real-time correspondence if you need it?
Well, I think that can be really jarring too as a parent if you go into it thinking like, oh, this BCBA is my point person, and you're reaching out during the day to get that update of like, oh, how are they eating? How's this going? Whatever. And the BCBA is like not responding, not on their phone. That can be really jarring as a parent because you're like, wait, what? I don't know what's happening. So knowing that up front, I think definitely can help set the expectation, like you said.
Yeah, and then see like maybe they have a log that they send home at the end of the day.
Some
again, going
pictures,
back to that communication. Yeah, is it a texting service? Is it a folder they send home with them? But how can I get the updates, especially if your child is kind of in those emerging stages of communication where they're not going to be able to tell you
themselves.
I ate XYZ for lunch. I went to the bathroom at this time. I had my diaper changed at this time.
Which kind of goes into another question we have on here, which is, what is my child's typical schedule? So sometimes you'll be working with certain providers who have very set schedules for either age groups or that'll break kids up, and just that way there's a flow to have set learning opportunities present throughout the day. So that'd be a great question to ask a provider, is what would that look like day to day? And sometimes they can provide you with a physical copy of what their day looks like. So that way you have some peace of mind knowing like, oh, look, it's 12 o'clock. So that means my kiddo's going to be at snack time, whatever. Just so you kind of have a general feel for what their day looks like.
Yeah, and that connection too.
100%. I guess another question too that I know we actually get asked this one a lot, and I think it's a great question, is how often does my BCBA stay with my child? Is that something that, this is going to be my kid set person the entire time they're here? Are changes going to happen? What about the technicians? What does that look like?
Yeah, and I think, burnout is real in most professions nowadays. And so if someone tells you that this person will be your BCBA forever, they would never change, they are definitely lying to you.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing to take away is how the communication about it goes down.
Right.
Who's going to be the person communicating with you regarding, any changes that come? Do they maybe kind of regularly rotate cases, even if the BCBA doesn't leave the company? Do they change providers to get different perspectives?
I will say that I think, in my opinion, frequent changes though with your BCBA, I do think is a little bit of a red flag.
I think so too.
Yeah, so I think like some changes happen, like you said, the burnout, other perspectives, those are definitely, I think, very important and natural reasons to change providers.
And I feel like we could do red flags as an episode.
Oh, that's true. Okay, maybe we won't get into all of that.
But
Stay tuned.
I do think it's like a, you know, again, right? It's all kind of that response cost of like
100%.
What is the priority to you, and you know, maybe are there other factors that are higher priority wise,
right? Than
that. But I agree. I mean, consistency is key for everyone.
Which gets into our next question with the technician piece.
Yes.
That one, I think, more than BCBAs, I think that is one of the biggest questions I get is, oh, I haven't seen so-and-so in a bit. Or, you know, is this going to be my child's normal person at this time of day? I think that that's a really important question. And sometimes you work at companies where they assign you one person. And especially, I know In-Home does a lot of that too. You have less
like you have
changes.
Your one person, and that's the only
you have
person who's going to work
it's
with
like
your
one
child.
or two, and then that's it. Versus you have some where it's like your kid might be working with 5 technicians in a day.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with either of those, but I think being aware of what you think would be the best fit for your learner.
Yeah, because some
your child
kiddos,
is best.
Right? Talking about generalization,
yes.
my favorite thing, right? If your child has a really difficult time with that, they're going to have a hard time if they have 5 techs in one day.
Right.
But if that's not a barrier for your child, then that wouldn't necessarily be a barrier to them.
Or like even rigidity with who the people are. If it's like, because just like we talked about with burnout, that is also very, very present with technicians, especially. It is not.
It's even more so.
Even more so. And it's not uncommon for there to be very high turnover with technicians, unfortunately. And hopefully that's something that the field addresses in the future. We figure out how to address those barriers. But it is a reality of a situation. So kind of knowing, maybe even asking, like, what are some ways that you guys work to retain your technicians because burnout is so present?
Or ways that they have kind of built in to address the burnout. Because maybe they do like BCBA teams where, you know, there's like a smaller group, like a subgroup within the clinic who all work with your child. So that way if there is turnover, you know, there's still a portion that is like the familiarity. Whereas if they have one person and that person leaves, then you're like starting over with someone new, which can be hard.
Right, 100%. And I think one of our last questions we have for this kind of general topic would be hybrid options for attendance. So some clinics allow you to do a mixture of in-home or in-clinic and in school. And so communicating with your provider and knowing whether or not that'd be an option in the future, especially if you're considering, like we talked about, that like titration piece, being able to fade down services, knowing if it's an option to split your child's time to help them with that transition or, you know, set them up for success when learning a certain set of skills is really beneficial.
Yeah, which I think does kind of go into another thing is with the clinic that you're going with, finding out if they have any like restrictions that they have on like client ages, because some are like specific to early learners, some are specific to you know, kind of elementary age, and so really kind of figuring out going into it how kind of long-term could this fit be?
Right.
You know, because ideally, right, we want them to be able to access different things. You may have certain goals, but it may be like, well, you know, they're doing really well here, and so we want to keep this progress going, but knowing in the back of your mind, like, do they have like a solid, you know, age where they're like, okay, at this point, right, we're going to suggest a transition, and whether or not maybe they have someone that they partner with or whatever who is able to provide for that next kind of age group.
Yeah.
But just knowing ahead of time what that's going to look like so you can adjust your expectations and know, okay, you know, this is when I'm going to want to start looking at other options.
100%. And I think that kind of covers it for some of our general questions we have for clinic-specific supports. We did also have a subsection of quality of care type questions that are really helpful to ask your providers.
Yeah, and so this is really looking at beyond the logistical piece.
Right.
Right? Like, what is going to be the core values, you know, the heart of the programming that is specific to my child, to make sure that, because I mean, it's hard to say which is more important, right? Because they all way differently, but this is really going to be like the morals and values of the programming that your child has. And
questions that people usually don't think to ask,
yeah,
which I think is why it's good that we're covering this.
Yes.
And so I guess that kind of leads into one of the
really recognizing if compassionate care is a major pillar for them within their company. I think tells you a lot about the focuses of your providers specifically, because typically, from what I've seen with companies that really focus on the compassionate care approach, they have certain things in place to ensure that that is maintained across care with their kiddos specifically.
yeah, and I think Ascent is such a huge topic within the compassionate care movement, and so I think really
Well, an Ascent
yes
is
Ascent
is so that's something too. We kind of, one of the first things we talk about in family guidance is, at least whenever I'm taking on a new family, is the role that Ascent plays in my programming. And so Ascent is, you can think of it as almost like consent that a child is giving to a provider, to a technician, essentially for therapy to be administered.
I think that's a good way to sum it up. And I think with that in mind, right, I think another thing too, right, if you're kind of unsure of what that looks like for your child, or like what that would mean as far as if you feel like they're very resistant to engaging in a lot of things, just having a conversation about them of like, these are the behaviors that my child demonstrates, you know, so how exactly, and like what would that look like within it, to make sure that that is something that is being taken into consideration.
Which I think ties in really beautifully with our next question.
All these tie-ins
They
so
are
beautifully.
so nice.
It's almost like we planned it
It's
that
all,
way.
yeah, it's almost like we have a template. No, it ties into the idea of higher intensity behaviors. So things like aggression, if you have any self-injurious behaviors like headbanging, things like that. A really important question is, do you utilize restraints? And it's not something that anyone really wants to talk about. It's not a comfortable conversation, but it's very important up front that you're aware of, if worst case scenario does happen with my child, what is going to be done? What
and I think another question to go into that too, especially if your child has high intensity behaviors, is what is kind of the threshold to where restraint is used.
Right.
Because I don't necessarily, I mean, restraints are a very hot topic, but they are ultimately designed for safety at the end of the day. But I think, so finding out what their values are of how comfortable they are supporting before they get to that point is really important to understand. And kind of the protections they have in place to prevent it happening unless it is truly like an extreme scenario.
Well, and I think too, not every setting has the correct environment for all learners. So sometimes you have kiddos who maybe they engage in property destruction, let's say, which is, like throwing items, furniture, whatever. Not every setting is going to be conducive to that learner staying safe. And so you want to make sure too that you're not putting your child in an environment where restraints maybe would be more likely to be used, because the environment is not conducive to them being safe.
Exactly.
And to other kiddos in that space also being safe. So that's kind of, just some important things to ask with that.
Yeah. And I think too, especially if you do have your child in different settings, making sure they're aligned, right? So making sure, if they're in school part of the day, that is aligned with what.
Another important question to ask is, what do we do if your child's progress is delayed or stalling? again, these are not fun conversations to have with providers, but it is the reality of situations where sometimes you're going to hit a bump in the road where maybe it's like your kid is not acquiring new skills maybe at a rate that you'd like, or, you know, maybe you're starting to see some regression in skills that they had already previously had. And so having those honest conversations with your provider of what happens when we get to that place, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I do think you should keep in mind too, right? When you're having these questions with your provider, especially if they're a new provider, they're not necessarily going to be able to give you very specific answers because they don't know your child, they don't know kind of your situation, and that's okay, but they should be able to still answer these questions.
100%, at least in a general sense.
Yes.
Like, here's what we would do.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the next thing is how individualized can you make it to your client's needs? So if you do have those really specific, really specific concerns about being able to, go on a walk in the park or, transition to the bathroom, whatever that is for your family, like, are you able to address those? Because you want to know before you start services. Because if the main reason you're seeking services is because of a specific context or a specific behavior or a specific situation, and they're not able to work on that,
you want to know that.
You want to know that ahead of time so you can find someone who can. Because ultimately, right, it's not necessarily saying they're a good or bad provider, because there'll be limitations based on, like,
a variety of things.
With their location, the layout of the building, the availability of X, Y, and Z, but just knowing that ahead of time so that way you can decide, is this my deal breaker?
100%. And then I guess going into deal breakers, another really important question is, do the staff that are serving my child and my family receive some sort of ongoing training or support with that cultural competency piece
Yes.
of care? Obviously, every family has their own unique background, their own unique cultural needs, and it's really important that you're with a provider that recognizes that, is willing to learn, because no one is going to know everything.
Absolutely.
But
the openness of it, to be willing to have a conversation, because sometimes too I feel like they can be kind of awkward, because you never want to offend somebody by asking honest questions, but sometimes they are really personal, and so it's just kind of,
it's a vulnerable situation.
Exactly.
Too,
but ultimately it is your family, right, and your child, and you want them to have the values and you
want instilled
exactly
in them. And making sure you're with a provider too that's not pushing their own values on your family unit, especially when you're thinking about what's most important to your family, because that is going to inform the way that care is handled, because you might have certain sets of things that, like, this for my family is okay, but maybe for another family it's not. And just being honest and building that trust with your provider. And even just asking some broad questions just about how that stuff is handled, I think is really important.
And I think too, so many times they're very, it may be, cultural considerations that you want them to be able to engage in when they're meeting. So whether it's, using utensils or not using utensils, eye contact is a hot topic.
Oh, yeah.
What hand they wipe with when they're toileting.
Or even eating, like whether, did you already say that?
Yeah, utensils.
Oh,
yes, I did say that.
Sorry, I got distracted by the baby. What am I to do?
But all of those things are so vital to be aware of, because again, for all these questions, there's a right and wrong answer for your family, but there's not a right and wrong answer to where, the provider necessarily, well, maybe, but there is, but a lot of it is just, is it going to meet the needs of your family? Mm-hmm. And that's really what it goes down to.
And you being empowered to make that decision by having all the necessary information, having those conversations up front. Like you said, you're setting the expectations, you're letting, people know what's most important to your family unit.
Yeah.
And that's going to inform the type of choices that you're making when you're trying to decide your fit.
Yeah. And especially to just I know we keep honing in on like having these conversations early, but you want to make sure that, especially if you're in an area where there's a wait list, right? There's an evaluation process, all these things. You don't want to go so far down a road where you feel like like you're stuck.
Right.
You know, because you're like, well, I just wasted 6 months getting evaluated, doing all the things that I had to do,
call that
waiting on the
psychology.
wait list.
Was this like, there's like a name for that in psychology where it's like, some cost or sunk cost, or you know,
don't know.
where it's like it's like I've been waiting in line for 50 minutes. I might as well.
Yeah, like I'm already, yeah.
There's a name for that in psychology. There's like a phenomenon, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I don't know.
Interesting. But yeah, no, I completely agree with you. You don't want to feel like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? You want to be able to be the one in the driver's seat making that decision yourself.
Yeah, because ultimately, even if it does mean waiting a little longer to start services or something like that,
It's more
important to have a good fit and for having someone who is going to be meeting your needs for your child.
100%. Well, those are some of our general things and some questions that might at least just give you a good springboard to go off of when you're trying to find, a good provider and a good fit for your family.
Yes. So, as always, we are keeping it behavioral, where we're guiding autism and fostering hope, having our episodes on Thursdays.
In the most ideal world, we will do our best.
But please follow us on Instagram if you haven't already at Keeping It Behavioral, as well as following us on your favorite podcasting platforms. And as always, right, just a disclaimer, we're behavior analysts. We're not giving individualized advice or treatment guidance. We're just using our knowledge to have a honest conversation about these topics and just sharing that, with this community.
Yes. And we will see you next time.
Awesome.